So let's get housekeeping out of the way. Support me on Patreon if you can. Do take care of yourself and your community first. Subscribe to me on all the socials if you want to. I'm going to keep on using clickbaity titles because they drive up the engagement, but let's get into the video. Capitalism creates such conditions where not only we lose our ability to connect with others, we also lose the ability to connect to ourselves. So because of the fragmentation, because of all of these identities that are available to us for purchase and to borrow, we definitely lose out on a lot of social skills, but it's also affecting our ability to perceive reality and to perceive the truth. We are very, very cynical oftentimes because of the fragmentation, because of fragmented collectives and communities. We may feel like we cannot trust people because today they were supporting us, but tomorrow they're going to forget about our existence because we no longer suit into their particular narrative. And because of this, we feel more isolated and atomized. But because of this, we may also tend to develop chauvinistic views because it's much easier to distance yourself from the source of your pain when you dehumanize the source of your pain. When you start perceiving people as your enemies, as too different to be able to connect to, then it's much easier for you to bear the pain of not only abandonment, but also of fragmentation. Because most of us don't know what fragmentation is, and we don't understand how exactly the capitalist alienation affects us. We perceive the things happening to us as lack of luck, which is true to an extent, but we may also attribute it to other sources, like these groups of people being inherently worse or inherently more prejudiced. And this is where identity politics really does not serve us. It actually brings in a further divide. And I already talked a little bit about identity politics. I don't really want to talk about this because I don't want to deepen that divide even more. We should be accepting people based on the fact that they're working class people, and that's it. That's the only criteria that I think is important. But going back to the statement that fragmentation leads to us possibly developing chauvinist ideas, well, the chauvinist ideas are generally supported by the status quo, by the capitalist ideology, because it is a part of the divide and conquer technique. It makes it so much easier to manipulate people. It plays off of the fears that are very common and very easily understood by the vast majority of us. So it is a very easy trap to fall into, and it takes conscious effort to fight against it. Now, chauvinism doesn't always look like you wanting to discriminate against certain groups of people. Chauvinism can also portray itself in your preferences. This is where I'm going to insist you take some time to examine the reasons why you may like or dislike certain presentations, certain things, objects, people, etc. Because very few of those would be accidental. Most of these would be ideological constructs that happen to be here. They're not made by any evil plots necessarily. They are just there because they support, even unknowingly so, the capitalist status quo. And these fragments need to be examined not only for us to be more helpful to others, but it's also going to ease our pain, because it's much more painful to live surrounded by enemies, to live without understanding other people's motivations. And when you justify their motivations, that's usually not enough. So it's much more helpful to be able to understand other people, their motivations, why they do certain things. And it's also helpful for you to understand yourself and your own intrinsic motivations, so to speak. And this is where you need to start dissecting those ideological fragments to see what's at the core of them. Because most of the modern ideological constructs, at the core of them, they have some Christian tenets. Watch my video on Protestantism and decolonization. They also may have white supremacy, which is unfortunately affecting every single person. Even me, living very far away from the imperial core, I still have some internalized white supremacy. It also will have all kinds of myths that capitalism has created, such as the just world hypothesis, the myth of meritocracy, individualism, the rugged individual stereotype, etc. All of these obviously connect to the previous two, but when you look at those underlying reasons as to why you may feel strongly about something, this is when you can start actively changing this, because it usually is not helpful to perceive somebody or something from an unconscious viewpoint. You need to understand why you feel or think a certain way. This is also helpful when you deconstruct art, and just as I stated in my previous video, Art is a very deep spiritual experience to most of us, and it should be. But when we examine our art preferences, this is where some of these unconscious biases and unconscious prejudices are going to come into play. Now, some may argue that all biases and all prejudices are unconscious, and I kind of agree. But I do want to point out the unconscious nature of these, just because so many of us think that, oh, we know that we have these biases, but we don't act accordingly. It doesn't really matter what we say. What matters is what we do. So with our action, we're able to prove to ourselves and others our true intentions, and through examining our thoughts, feelings, and actions, we're able to create a more concrete understanding of ourselves. And this is where Lacanian psychoanalysis may be helpful. I talked about delirium and how Lacan considered much of us speaking to be a part of that delirium, where we're not necessarily talking to an opponent, but we're talking to this imaginary, the other, this embodiment of this big subject, this embodiment of this ideological other, this social ego, whatever you want to call it. But this is a very helpful framework, because when you start distancing yourself from yourself, observing yourself, then paradoxically you get a closer connection to oneself. And this also may remind you of some tenets of Buddhism. If you looked into Buddhism, if you looked into Buddhist practices, they often tell you to observe your thoughts and your feelings and not associate yourself with them, meaning that it was understood by the people thousands of years ago that we cannot associate ourselves with some fleeting moments of our existence. So there was this deep dialectical understanding of the nature of men, and people realized that personhood and identity was very complex and consisting of many of these internal contradictions. So when we start observing our thoughts and our feelings as something that is passing through us, that does not have to linger and stay and dictate our actions, then we'll find it easier to connect to others, to examine the material circumstances, to understand what course of action we need to take. And I talked about this at length in some of my previous videos, but we all need to understand that we are all ideological subjects, and that doesn't make us bad, because in our pursuit of goodness, we oftentimes start to try and prevent thought crimes or feeling crimes, and we are upset when we realize that we may not be that stereotypical good person, but this stereotypical good person only exists to reproduce the conditions of production. This is like an invisible whip. This is like a big brother watching over us, dictating to us what to think and what to feel. But when we understand our connection to all things, when we understand that we are a part of this universal substance, then we don't have to worry about fleeting thoughts and ideas and feelings. We can partake thoughtfully in all kinds of practices, and we don't have to be led by these fleeting moments of our existence. We can listen to them, we can try and understand what it is they're trying to communicate, because they may communicate something that is hidden from us, and sometimes we can let them pass. But we cannot have this unconscious ideology dictate our fate and our course of action. And we have to try to do our best to examine all the reasons, all the underlying reasons as to why we have certain preferences, certain ideas, certain thoughts, certain beliefs, certain feelings, etc. So I'm going to keep on encouraging everyone to do so. I'm engaged in this journey. I've been engaged in it for years and years and years. It's not easy, but it's actually very helpful. Even if you go through several months of such observations and examinations, you will see a material benefit more often than not, with some exceptions, obviously. So let me know what you think. I hope you have a great day today. Consider supporting me on Patreon. Do take care of yourself and your community first. Subscribe to me on all the socials if you want to, and I'll talk to you sometime later.